Americans for Prosperity North Dakota proudly supported important policy improvements that broke barriers for all North Dakotans this legislative session. From tackling unnecessary and burdensome occupational licensing standards to fighting for tax relief, AFP is proud to have played a part in improving the lives of North Dakotans this year. Join AFP today by visiting www.afpnd.org. This advertisement was paid for by Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I am your host, Rob Port. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me after this introductory segment here to answer your questions. And we talk, of course, about Robert Mueller testifying before Congress. Remember, if you want to send questions to Senator Kevin Cramer or Congressman Kelly Armstrong, you can do so. Just email them to rob@sayanythingblog.com anytime. Or watch my social media. You can post them up. I put up open threads the days I'm going to interview them. And if you're following me on social media, you can post your questions there, and I will certainly be happy to ask your questions of them. We have some good questions this week, but before we get there, I talked about Senator Cramer about this a little bit, but I wanted to expand on it here. Let me start with some backstory. When I was a kid, I listened to a lot of Rush Limbaugh. This would have been in the late 80s. It was when I was growing up in Alaska. Early 90s, early to mid 90s, I spent a lot of time listening to Rush Limbaugh because that's what my parents were listening to. He was very popular at the time, a lot of people tuning in. And I would say he was very formative, at least in inspiring my interest in politics. And I'm a conservative, and I find myself agreeing with him a lot of the time. And I think he's just a tremendously talented guy. He is very entertaining to listen to, and often informative too. So suffice it to say that over the years I have developed a lot of respect for Rush Limbaugh and his approach to the way he does things. I've emulated in some ways. I wouldn't say that stylistically. Here I am, a lowly podcaster and regional commentator comparing himself to Rush Limbaugh. I don't know that I merit that comparison, but suffice it to say he was inspiring to me. So imagine my surprise recently when Rush Limbaugh said, essentially, deficits don't matter anymore. Now, this shocked me because for years I've heard Rush Limbaugh talk about the national debt and talk about the deficit and talk about out of control. Our friends on the left who are out of control with their approach to the fiscal situations of this country, the fiscal policies of this country. And I always felt that was right. And in fact, I always felt that was a central tenet of conservatism, because what does conservatism mean if not limiting government? What does it mean to be a Republican? What does it mean to be conservative if you're not in favor of more individual liberty, more freedom, and smaller federal government? Or generally government that's kept in its box, governments that's small. And what is conservatism? In fact, what is liberalism? What is any sort of public service? What is any sort of public involvement without being concerned about the fiscal realities of our country? Our nation has a budget. Our nation must make its ends meet, just like anybody else. I mean, this is just basic responsibility. And now, let me read to you what Rush Limbaugh said. There was a caller, and so the first part is the caller, and the caller asks, in 2019, there's going to be a $1 trillion deficit. Trump doesn't really care about that. He's not really a fiscal conservative. We have to acknowledge that Trump has been cruelly used. Now, this is Limbaugh's response to that. He says, I quote, "Nobody is a fiscal conservative anymore. All this talk about concern for the deficit and the budget has been bogus for as long as it's been around." It's been bogus this whole time? Now, I admit that very often in this Trump era, I find myself feeling a bit like a man without a country. Because, again, I grew up as a conservative. I definitely have some libertarian leanings, but for the most part, I'm conservatively libertarian. That's what I like to tell my friends. And in fact, I think that's how I listed myself on Facebook when I was creating my profile all those years ago. I am conservatively libertarian, and so I've always taken the position that, well, we ought to keep government small. And at the very least, we ought to balance our budget. There ought to be consequence. If we're going to expand the size of government, then there should be some pain because we ought to pay for that expansion. Right? Like if we want more government, if we want government to do new things, if there's some shiny new program that we want government to do, in a perfect world, we would say, okay, we're going to do this thing, but also this is how we're all going to pay for it. Because again, I think that's an important component of government. I think it's an important component of self-governance, right? Which is what we practice here in the United States. We don't have some aristocracy that governs us. We govern ourselves. Any one of us could run for public office. And if we got enough support, any one of us could be the president of the United States or a member of the Senate or of Congress or of the state legislature or the governor, or on and on and on. And so if we're all involved in the government, if the government belongs to us, to paraphrase President Barack Obama, if government is a name for that thing we do together, then we ought to have some skin in the game when it comes to paying for it. And essentially what deficits and debt allow politicians to do is do things without ever really there being a consequence. We could just give the public things and nobody has to pay for it, I guess. I mean, that's essentially what we're doing. I mean, granted, we're all paying federal taxes and state taxes. We're all paying all sorts of taxes, but we're also, hundreds of billions of dollars, sometimes over $1 trillion a year of government spending that we're not paying for. We're just adding to the national debt. Nobody's paying for that. Not really. Somebody at some point probably is going to have to. But what Rush Limbaugh is saying, and it's shocking to me because we were always supposed to care about this, but what Rush Limbaugh is saying is that it's just bogus to care about that. Nobody cares about that anymore. Now, maybe this attitude isn't that uncommon. I remember a quip from Ronald Reagan back in the day, right? The conservative. Ronaldo Magnus, I think is what Rush Limbaugh calls him. Back in the day, I think Ronald Reagan said something to the effect that he doesn't worry about the budget deficit. It's big enough. It can take care of itself. So maybe politicians, even Republicans, having a cavalier attitude towards the debt and the deficit, maybe that's not a new thing. It's certainly in practice, Republicans haven't cared. If you look back during the Bush years, Republicans exploded the national debt. And the Obama years, we exploded the national debt. I mean, Republicans, to Rush Limbaugh's point, Republicans have only been paying lip service to fiscal issues for a while now. They haven't really been practicing what they preach for a while. But here's what worries me. If we lose fundamental policy differences, right, if the conservative movement, Republic, whatever you want to call it, if the right, to use that word generally for conservative, libertarian, that the right, if we're not distinct from the left on issues when it comes to spending, and all it's really about anymore is what we're going to spend on, well, then what does that mean? Where are we? What's the point of any of this? I mean, if there's no fiscal restraint anymore, if it doesn't matter anymore, if the national debt doesn't matter, we can just spend, and Republicans will spend what they're going to spend on, and Democrats are going to spend what they spend on, I feel like we're in a lot of trouble. And I feel like the only distinction at that point now is just culture, right? It's all just culture war. And that's certainly a feature, I would call it a bug, of the Trump era, is that it's all culture war all the time. It's not philosophical differences. It's not, ideological differences. Really, it's just cultural differences. Because you'll hear Senator Cramer later in this episode say that Donald Trump's not really a conservative. He didn't campaign as a conservative. He's a populist. That's who he really is. And I think that that's true. But if he's not a conservative, then what are we doing? What does the Republican Party stand for anymore? Again, I came to conservatism. The first presidential election I could vote in was the 2000 election. I was 20 years old. Before that, I couldn't vote in a presidential election before that. I was 20 years old. I voted for Al Gore in that hotly contested race because I was 20 years old. I hadn't been paying that close of attention to politics at that point in my life. I'd spent a lot of time listening to Rush Limbaugh, but as you could see, ideologically, it didn't necessarily rub off on me. It was... To me, I made a cultural choice because I viewed Republicans, probably through the filter of MTV and all the other things that were influencing me at the time. I viewed Republicans as being these, stick in the mud, old fuddy-duddies And I just thought Democrats were cooler. Democrats were less likely to, want to come in and tell me how to live my life. Now, I'm not sure how I was 20 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. I should have remembered that it was Tipper Gore, then wife to Al Gore, who I voted for, who was bringing all the metalheads and everybody else before Congress, giving them hell about their lyrics on their music. So I don't know what I was thinking. But when I came to conservatism, when I came to feel about the world as I feel about it today, what lured me there was Ronald Reagan. What lured me there was Milt Friedman, was this basic understanding that Republicans were going to be the adults in the room, and Republicans were going to be the tellers of hard truths. And Republicans were going to be the ones that say, no, we cannot afford that, or if we're going to spend that money, then we have to figure out a way to spend it. I have felt this way for a long time, and even though Republicans let me down over and over again, I can always say, well, at least this is what the movement aspires to. At least this is what the party aspires to, except to listen to one of the loudest voices in the conservative movement. It's not a thing that we aspire to anymore. To quote Rush Limbaugh again, nobody is a fiscal conservative anymore. All this talk about concern for the deficit and the budget has been bogus for as long as it's been around. That to me feels like a betrayal. Rush Limbaugh never really meant it when he was talking about the deficit and the debt. And if we didn't mean that, what else didn't we mean? I can tell you that I'm not going to change. I still care about the national debt. I still care about the deficit. I still care about responsible budgeting. I still believe there ought to be a connection between how big our government is and how much that government costs us. I think the way we're doing things now is the same as running your household budget and just deciding, hey, if we're spending more money than we make, we'll just put it on the credit card. Well, you know what? Someday the credit card payment, it's going to come due. I don't know this feeling like we could just run up national debt without end and it never has to be paid off. There's no time in history where that's been the case, where it's just never have to been paid off. As a matter of fact, one of the things that catapulted the United States of America into greatness, into a superpower, was World War I, not necessarily because of our military involvement in it, but because the United States of America and various entities thereof loaned so much money to the primary participants of World War I. In fact, we loaned Great Britain so much money, it was just a few years ago that they finally paid us back. That debt matters. And now what we're doing to ourselves, we're doing essentially what Great Britain did to itself during World War I. We have made ourselves indebted. This is a scary thing, and we ought to be concerned about, except our current Republican leadership, the people who for years and years have positioned themselves to say, we are the ones to trust on fiscal responsibility. We are the ones who are going to hold the line. They are saying it doesn't matter anymore. If that's the Republican brand, what's the distinction from Democrats? Is it just culture war? Is it just I'm urban and you're rural? I mean, is that all it is? I don't know that sort of a political divide is healthy for our country. Senator Kevin Cramer up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me now. Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I am doing great. A lot going on in Washington D.C. today. We're recording as we're recording this. Mueller testified to one House committee this morning. I guess I logged off because I needed to get ready for this interview, but he may still be testifying before another House committee. Now, I know this is before House committees, but I'm certain you've probably been paying some level of attention to it. Well, what did you see? And let me ask you, because I'm looking. This is a political headline. The headline is Bob Mueller is struggling. Another headline, this is from Byron York at the Washington Examiner. Confused performance by Mueller raises questions about handling of investigation. And that's not just coming from the right, by the way. I saw David Axelrod, who is political advisor to former President Barack Obama, said, basically on Twitter, hey, I respect Bob Mueller, but he may not be up to this. What did you see? I mean, was that a concern for you? His demeanor, I guess. He seemed confused at times. He seemed not to maybe know some parts of the investigation. Was that concerning to you at all?
Well, I didn't see a lick of it. Maybe 2 minutes total as I was walking by a TV a couple times. But so I don't know any of that. I don't know Robert Mueller. Let me just tell you, my official response that we'll be putting out here shortly is move on. I told a group of reporters yesterday, you do realize that you and a few of your observers are the only people that care about Bob Mueller's investigation, much less his further testimony. And I'm not surprised that that some of the Democrats were displeased or maybe were hoping for more. And I wouldn't be surprised if the same is true of Republicans who comment on it. Because one thing about Bob Mueller, he's done a pretty decent job of just saying nothing ever since this thing began. Now, he did make some comments after the report was out that I think fired up some Democrats, but by and large, he's been letting the report speak for itself. He said that that's what he was basically going to do when he came to testify before Congress. If that's what he did, I'm sure there are a lot of people going, well, that was a waste of time. And I just think, but as far as his capacity or his ability to answer the questions or his confusion, I couldn't speak to it. I didn't see enough of it to know. And by the way, again, I don't know Robert Mueller. I've never met Robert Mueller, so I don't even know what it necessarily would be the benchmark for me to judge it by.
One thing that Democrats seem to be making a lot, because they came out and they asked him, did this exonerate President Trump, or did your investigation exonerate President Trump? Mm-hmm. And he said no, and people are making a big deal out of that, but we know that. I mean, they concluded that before, and I've always thought that whole thing about, well, did the investigation exonerate him? No, it's like they're saying, okay, well then he must be presumed guilty. Then that's not really how any of this works. If you investigate me and you don't really find any evidence leading you to conclude that I should be prosecuted for a crime, then I am innocent. Right? Because that's the presumption, right? I didn't do anything wrong.
Rob, you touch on what is the most disturbing part of the whole thing to me. It's not the report itself. It's not even that a whole bunch of Democratic activists and Hillary Clinton supporters were, on the investigation team. Those are all disturbing. But the most disturbing thing to me is that Robert Mueller doesn't seem to understand the American, judicial system, which is innocent until proven guilty. And his job as a special counsel was as a prosecutor. And the prosecutor's only job is to prosecute, not to exonerate. And there are only two categories in the prosecution: guilty and not guilty. And you're exactly right. So I think he really adds confusion, not just to the topic of his own investigation, but to the topic of America's judicial system and the foundation of it. And that is, there's no such thing as an exoneration in an investigation that's meant to prosecute. So I agree with you. I think that might be just some positioning so that he could have friends on both sides of the political aisle or equal number of enemies. I'm not sure which, but I do think it created some confusion that was unnecessary.
One thing, and again, this is another thing that people seem to be zeroing in on. He had given an answer earlier in the day. He had been asked essentially if they thought that Trump had, if Trump was basically getting away with obstruction because there's a DOJ policy that bars sitting presidents from indictment. I'm going to read from Politico here. I quote, After a lunch break, Mueller corrected an earlier answer in which he insinuated that his team might have charged Trump with obstruction of justice were it not for a DOJ policy, Department of Justice policy, that bars sitting presidents from indictment. That is not the correct way to say it, Mueller said. We did not reach a determination as to whether the president committed a crime. So I feel like Democrats are trying to run away with, say, well, the only reason Trump's unindicted is because he's a sitting president and the DOJ won't prosecute a sitting president. Mueller's saying, no, we didn't determine that he committed a crime, which again gets back to the point we just were talking about.
That's a very important distinction, Rob. I wasn't aware of this until just now, but that's a really important distinction, and you got to give him credit for providing clarification after lunch break to that answer, because those are two very different answers. But it gets to exactly to your point. The role is not exoneration. The role is guilty or not guilty, and granted, the burden for guilt is higher than the burden for innocence, and as it ought to be. That's part of the exceptionalism of the American system, frankly. But even that said, so for him to say no, we just basically said we don't think that it rose to the level of a crime, or we couldn't convict him of a crime. That's different than saying there's a prohibition in the rules.
The other thing that was interesting, speaking to the obstruction thing, and I think the other part that everybody's ignoring, right? Because this is also complicated, but they've moved the goalpost to instructions. Where this all started was Russian collusion. But as is often the case when we get a special prosecutor, we start going after one thing, and then the people who end up getting convicted or somebody who like misremembered something. Usually it's like a perjury charge or something comes out.
Right.
And so the goalpost got moved from obstruction. It was supposed to be collusion with the Russians, and then it got moved to whether or not President Trump obstructed the investigation. He was asked directly this during the hearing. He was asked directly, did the president in any way, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially, did the president in any way attempt to influence the investigation? And his answer was a flat no.
I mean, I don't know how that doesn't settle it then, frankly. I really don't. Other than he was just looking for, grasping for something. You know, when you're special counsel, and this has always been the problem with special counsels, if you come up with nothing after spending millions of dollars, in this case tens of millions of dollars, it's almost like you failed, when the reality is, the point of the special counsel, and the reason I supported it in the first place, and I will tell you, I will think long and hard about ever supporting another one for either party, is to reinstate some confidence in our system. And I don't, this didn't do that at all. This really created more chaos and less confidence in our judicial system and in our system of justice, in my view, and certainly in the Department of Justice and the FBI and all the other agencies that are associated with it. So, and I think, Rob, getting back to sort of the excellence of our system and what makes the American system so great, besides innocence until proven guilty, and the burden is on the prosecutors, is that we have three co-equal branches of government, and the policy-making branch, the branch with oversight responsibilities, that is to say the Congress of the United States, is bicameral. So you have really almost four different well, they're not four branches, but three branches, but one branch with two distinct agencies, if you will. And so that's the checks and balances that our founders came up with, and there's nowhere where a special counsel, which is not really answerable. I mean, they're technically answerable to the Attorney General, who's answerable to the President of the United States, but this independence, we stress independence so often in this country on so many things. Well, we have an elected system, not an independent system. And while you certainly want an independent-minded judiciary, and you clearly want an independent-minded law enforcement agencies, that's baked into our system already without creating another less accountable agency. And so I frankly think that special counsels have way too much power, and they have way too much money. In fact, they have basically an open checkbook and subpoena powers. And I watching this operation makes me, concerned that we should maybe think about even just doing away with them all.
Do we do too many investigations? Because it seems like every week we ought to investigate this, we ought to investigate that, and both sides are calling to investigate everything all the time. And I wonder if we're not just at a point where there's a point where it reaches absurdity. Now, I say that I'm very much in favor. I mean, I'm a member of the news media, I guess, although sometimes maybe they don't believe it, but I am a member of the news media.
I don't know many journalists, if any, that hold the system more accountable than you do, Rob.
Well,
so, you're a very important part of the checks and balances.
That's flattering of you to say. I am in favor of, I like looking under the rocks. There's no question about that. But there's a point at which it's just absurd. I mean, I remember like in 1 week in some of this, like there was like half a dozen different investigations called for by different members of Congress into different things. At some point, I don't know. I mean, the process itself holds people accountable. Democrats don't like Republicans. Right. Republicans don't like Democrats. Some Democrats don't like other Democrats, and some Republicans don't like other Republicans. It seems like if there's dirt out there, it's going to come out, and I say that, maybe that's Pollyannish of me to say, but I don't know. We reach a point of absurdity where everybody's calling to investigate everything. Who's paying attention to any of this anymore?
So I think very few people. I told a group of legislators, as I said yesterday, that asked me about the Mueller thing. Would I be watching it? That's what it was. They said, how closely will you be watching the Mueller investigation? I said, I've got a really, really full plate. And I don't plan to watch any of it. And I said, because I'm about as interested as most North Dakotans are. And I said, frankly, other than you and a few of your observers, a few of your readers, I don't think very many Americans are interested in it. And I think that's the reality. And the problem is that all these investigations, to your point, and they do two things. One, they are a distraction from other important policy work that we have to be doing. And secondly, each one sort of undermines the credibility of the other. When everything's under investigation, it sort of diminishes the importance of a single investigation. And I think in whether it's time, energy, financial resources, your mental attention, capital is important, and you don't have an unlimited supply of it. You have to spend all of your resources on the things that are most important. I think a 2-year budget deal is pretty important. I think governing is important. I think debt and deficit are important. The military is important. There are a lot of important things that we do that matter of the Constitution and our responsibilities, and investigations are one of many, but maybe not such a high priority as they've become, because they've become political theater, Rob. That's the reality of it, is they've become political theater. And this is why, frankly, when you look at the divided Congress and you look at just how far divided we are, but the fact that Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi, with all their differences, can actually negotiate a 2-year budget. There's many things not to like about it, but I think we ought to at least be encouraged by the fact that they got something done, and that maybe there's hope for the United States-Mexico-Canadian agreement and different things. That's really where attention needs to be put, and resources need to be put more on that than
we just spent 13 minutes talking about an investigation that we both agree is not, but the thing is, it's unavoidable. I mean, it's what's going on. It's intense media coverage. I know you've got I know there's people listening to this show that want to hear you react to this stuff. So I mean, it's out there and it's unavoidable, but I wish we could focus on governing like. And this is why I get paid the big bucks, Kevin, is this segue right here. Important stuff like the budget deal. On Monday, congressional leaders and President Trump, the Trump administration, I should say, they announced an agreement on legislation that would set budget and spending parameters, I guess, for the next couple of years. Mm-hmm. And it would suspend the debt limit through July 2021. Which I've heard people saying that suspend always before we talked about increasing the debt limit. This is suspending the debt limit. What's the distinction there? Is there a distinction?
There's not much of one. They have the same outcome. The fact that we have a debt limit or a debt ceiling is, you hit that ceiling and you can't borrow any more money to pay your obligations. So then you're on a cash only basis.
It's not really a ceiling. I mean,
or whether you say you suspend it, it's the same thing.
It's not.
Some people, by the way, would like to eliminate it altogether, Rob. So you don't have this political theater every couple of years or 6 months or however long you suspend the debt ceiling for, and just accept the fact that we're always going to raise the debt ceiling because we never want to not be able.
It's never limited. It's never limited anything, really. I mean, it's not a ceiling so much as it's a hot air balloon that just keeps going up and up and up into the stratosphere.
Right. Right, and it's really not even the problem. No, I will say this: the reason we deal with it on a more regular basis rather than just eliminating it permanently is because it becomes a tool for negotiation, like it did just this week, and that is that it's leverage for more substantial things or somewhat related things, such as spending caps, such as reforms. And in some years in the past, we've gotten pretty significant reforms out of raising the debt ceiling. And this time we got a 2-year, budget cap deal that raises the caps, or actually eliminates the Budget Control Act sequestration process and the caps that were built into that in 2011.
Let me ask you, because I want to get into some specifics of the budget deal, and then we'll get on to listener questions. But I noticed something interesting. I'm reading Tim Alberta's book, American Carnage, about sort of the beginning with the Tea Party movement and the election of Barack Obama and sort of the two failed Republican campaigns against him up into the election of Donald Trump. It's very, very good. I don't know if you've read it, but I recommend it if you haven't. But in there, he's talking about how Republicans just sort of stopped caring about fiscal discipline. And then on Twitter the other day, I was being critical of President Trump, and some of his supporters were telling me how terribly, terribly wrong I was. And one of the things I mentioned is gosh, I would say that, sometimes President Trump doesn't seem that particularly conservative because, look, spending's out of control. And their response to me as Republicans was, who cares about the national debt, which is shocking to hear from Republicans. And then Rush Limbaugh the other day basically said that all this fiscal conservative hand-wringing over the years about the national debt, including from him, I guess, was just a lot of nonsense. And nobody actually really cares about the deficit and the debt, and they don't really matter. Do you feel that way?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that it doesn't matter. I might agree to some degree that few people are worried about it. Now, there are some people who are, and some people are really worried about it. But I do think, right, and I didn't hear this, but your characterization of what Rush is saying is somewhat true in that most people are concerned about whatever the issues are that affect them. And if there's somebody who's on Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or food stamps or some other program, a safety net program, that's what they're concerned about. If you're in business, you're concerned about taxes being too high, regulations being too great, so on and so forth. Yeah. So by and large, the larger issue of debt and deficit take a back seat to the more personal issues, and I understand all of that. But here's we do have to look out for debt.
Here's what Rush Limbaugh said, because I know you're a Rush Limbaugh fan. I've been listening to Rush Limbaugh since I was a little boy in the backseat of my parents' car driving around Alaska. This is what he said. He
made you who you are today.
Well, maybe contributed in part, yeah. A caller called in and said this. In 2019, there's going to be $1 trillion deficit. Trump doesn't really care about that. He's not really a fiscal conservative. We have to acknowledge that Trump has been cruelly used. Limbaugh's response, and this is Rush Limbaugh talking, I quote, "Nobody is a fiscal conservative anymore. All this talk about concern for the deficit in the budget has been bogus for as long as it's been around."
Yeah, that's a cynical view, of course, but it's easy to be cynical these days. I can tell you, we just had a 2-hour lunch meeting with all Republican senators, and we had a very serious discussion about fiscal matters as we're talking through this budget deal. And you've heard me say this many times. Your listeners will hear me say it many, many more times. Until we deal with the mandatory side of the ledger, which is now 70%. And that is the entitlement programs and the other mandatory spending, things that we put into mandatory. And by the way, this budget deal avoided adding another mandatory spending piece because Nancy Pelosi wanted to add the Veterans Mission Act, the VA Mission Act, into the mandatory side of the ledger, and we insisted that it not be, and prevailed, fortunately. So that's $9 billion that's in this deal, the addition for VA, is 40% of the non-defense discretionary money that's added to the budget this year. So these are significant financial discussions that we have. So I don't know that I'd say that it's bogus, but I do think it's important is waned. And I say especially now, speaking of Donald Trump and being a conservative, nobody should have ever been confused by whether he'd be real conservative. He didn't run as a conservative. He ran more as a populist. He governs as a populist. He is a populist, and I think in some respects he's quite pragmatic about all of that. He's pragmatic about governing. He's pragmatic about politics. But now in this divided government, where you have to negotiate and you have to compromise to get anything done, that becomes even more prevalent. All of that said, Rob, I'm absolutely committed. And as you know, I talked about this during the campaign at great risk. I have in all of my campaigns. If we don't tackle entitlements, if we don't tackle the sacred cows, and remember, Donald Trump, when he ran, said, I will not touch Social Security. So we really have never, since he got elected, been in a position to deal with Social Security and make it more solvent as it heads toward insolvency. So Donald Trump's never been a real fiscal conservative. But here's what he's done. He's advanced policies, both legislative and executive, that have grown our economy and put us in a much more competitive place in the global marketplace, and continues to do that. And when you have a strong growing economy, things like debt and deficit, well, especially debt, do become less critical in the big picture. If debt as a percentage of the productivity of the country is a relevant issue, and that's part of what's eased the pain. Here's the other thing that I have a greater concern about, and I'll throw this one out. Maybe some of your listeners will be able to, text or email some questions for next week, or we have a larger discussion about it. But I sit on the banking committee, and of course we have oversight of the Federal Reserve, and I'm not a big monetary policy guy, Rob, but I do know this much, and I've spent more time in recent weeks on, CNBC and Bloomberg News and Bloomberg TV and Fox Business talking about these issues. We've become addicted to low interest rates in this country and monetary policy, and everybody looks to the Federal Reserve, including, by the way, President Trump, for relief whenever there's a hiccup in the, or even a potential hiccup in the economy. And I keep thinking, well, what are we going to cut when the economy's bad, or when inflation takes off, if we're going to cut interest rates down to zero when the economy's strong and good? I think we lose sight. We need to get back to the fundamentals of a growing economy: fewer regulations, lower taxes, bigger and better trade deals, marketing our products and selling American-made goods and American-made products and services, and raise everybody's standard of living that way, rather than worry about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve and low interest rates. And then because that's good for the stock market. Well, if we have a stock market built on interest rates, then we have reason to be concerned as well. So I think the issue of all economic policy, if you will, and that includes debt and deficit of the government and government spending, along with all these other things I've just been speaking of, I think we have to look at it holistically. And I think that's part of why we don't see the debt as the problem that it could be one day if there's a collapse of some sort, because we've been protecting ourselves from the debt and deficit with low interest rates.
Let's get to some questions. I think last week Kyle had asked a question about Title IX, and I think you and I couldn't really figure out what the question was. So he came back and he explained a little bit more. He says the Department of Education released a new proposed Title IX rule in November 2018, which addressed, among other things, the way universities investigate and address sexual misconduct on college campuses. There was a 60-day public comment period that closed the end of January 2019. I am wondering if the senator has heard anything from the Trump administration as to when the Department of Education will respond to the comments.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Kyle. And I don't know the answer to that. We will get on it. We'll find out what, if anything, they've said to this point. I will tell you what little bit I know about it, or just in observing what's been going on college campuses. It gets back to kind of how we started some of this with the Mueller investigation. We should never, ever in this country lose sight of that foundational principle of due process and innocent until proven guilty. And I don't care where the venue is, a college campus, a military post, or the streets of Minot or Bismarck. Wherever it is, due process is foundational to our exceptionalism. And I have seen a deterioration of that on college campuses with some of these higher profile cases where it appears that you're guilty until proven innocent. And by the way, similarly in some of our other institutions. And I just, our founders came up with a lot of things that weren't quite perfect, but they were really, really good. Due process might be the closest thing to perfect.
Let's continue. Haley asks from Facebook, If he supports marijuana businesses on a federal level with his latest work, does he support it in his home state of North Dakota? If so, does he only support it medically or recreationally as well? Now, I think she's referring to the States Act. I think that's her reference, but
sure. So there's two bills. Okay, first of all, thank you for the question. That's a really good and clear question. And did you say it was Haley that asked that?
Yes.
Okay, so to Haley's questions, there's two bills, two areas where I've been quite active in a leadership role as it relates to cannabis. And one is, it started with the SAFE Act. That's a banking act by basically what it says is that, in states where marijuana has been legalized, whether it's, whatever version of legal it is, whether it's for recreational use or just medicinal use, one or the other or both, that if it's been deemed legal in that state, that the banks ought to do business with them, that the banks should not impose their political will, if you will, on the industry. But more importantly than that, remembering that banks are FDIC insured, and that the industry is, as long as banking feels threatened, and understandably so, by federal law, you're going to see a cannabis industry that's a cash-only industry, and I can't believe anybody thinks that would be a good idea. So I just think it's really an honoring, if you will, of the federalism. Again, back to several other topics, it's a representative of cooperative federalism. To advance further, I was approached by some about the insurance industry. It has the same problem. Industries or businesses in states where cannabis is legal, again, whether medicinal or recreational or both, aren't able to get certain types of insurance, whether it's liability insurance, even property insurance. They're not able to get insurance, and we put up a bill called the Claim Act, and that allows the same principles behind the Claim Act that are behind the SAFE Act that again honors states' rights. So to me, it's just a federalist approach that opens the insurance market to businesses that are compliant, and then preventing the federal law from hindering the employees' market access to that product. To the second part of her question, I don't support recreational marijuana in North Dakota. I voted against it when it was on the ballot. I would vote against it again. I have not yet seen that recreational marijuana use has a benefit that outweighs the problems with it. I always have supported some measure of medicinal marijuana, including on the ballot. And even early in my House career, was always supportive of it, like with the VA and in experiments. And of course, it took off rather rapidly. I think marijuana is like any other drug. If it's under the appropriate regulation and doctors' care and doctors' prescriptions, why wouldn't we want to use it if it's got value to either healing or helping people get through injury or illness? But I'm not a supporter of it as a recreational drug, at least at this point.
Kenny asks, how can we replace the head of the Corps of Engineers and get this wall built?
Well, I'm not sure replacing the head of the Corps of Engineers would get the wall built any faster. I've had multiple discussions, as you know. In fact, I had one as recently as yesterday in the White House about this issue. I had one with an official a very high-ranking official at the Department of Defense. I will continue on it because we're not seeing a lot of new wall being built. Although, to be fair to the president, and some people have criticized him because they're building a bunch of wall, but none of it's new wall. It's replacements. Well, it's replacing a car barrier with a 30-foot wall. I think that's new wall. That's preventing the pedestrian traffic. It's preventing people from walking across our borders, as opposed to just stopping the Volkswagens, if you will, to come across. So, but the Corps is a very slow moving bureaucracy. But the Corps has additional challenges. It's not just all on the Corps either, because you have issues like the environmental process, the NEPA process, of getting the environmental reviews and all that stuff done, just like you would on a pipeline or anything else. You've got the takings process, and condemnation proceedings and whatnot when you're on private land, and a lot of it is on private land. So, and then of course you have the issue of the courts themselves. literally every proposal for emergency funds through the Department of Defense to be transferred for building the wall, even where there's been an award made to contractors, has been stopped in federal court and is held up now. So it's not just the Corps, although I'm no fan of the Corps and I continue to pound on them in their processes. Have great concerns, frankly, about their proposals and bid process.
Last question, and then we'll let you get that phone call. Lee asks...
You saved me from it, Rob.
Yeah, okay. Lee asks, when is Congress going to start initiating action against the Democrats' corruptions, which I think probably speaks to the point we were talking about at the beginning of this segment, which is everybody's investigating everybody these days. I guess Lee wants more investigations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking, it was Donald Trump himself who said he didn't want to investigate Hillary Clinton after he won the election. I'm not sure that's still his opinion, but that was right afterwards, because it does get to a point where you feel like, no, you know what, I won, let's govern, and sort of let the chips fall where they may. Yeah. But this is what I meant earlier when I said, if you investigate everything, then everything becomes less important. Every investigation becomes frivolous. But if you investigate only the things that are at have a certain level of seriousness or violation, you'd have a little more credibility. With regards to the specifics of the question, there is, as you probably know, there is in the Judiciary Committee an investigation going on. I don't know where they are in the process right now, or I don't think we've had hearings yet, but looking into the premise of course, the Steele dossier that was sort of the premise in the beginning of the Mueller investigation. It's the thing that triggered the whole special counsel in the first place. I do think it's legitimate to investigate elections and to investigate foreign influences in our elections, and that's been done to the point where the group that investigated it reported to Congress just a couple of weeks ago in a classified setting that the 2018 elections were very, very clean, and that any attempt to influence was pretty well stopped, and that there was no reason for further federal action. And by the way, Rob, this is important because we don't want a lot of federal action in our elections, because our elections are set up to be run by states. And there are a lot of people, particularly on the left, who think the solution to foreign influence on our elections is to federalize our elections and not have state-run elections. And then you know what you're talking about. Then you're talking about not just a national voter registration, but mandatory. And that becomes a really serious problem for me. That is a taking of personal and property or personal information, private information, and it's an imposition on every person in the United States of America. And that just turns it over, to the federal government, which I can't imagine would be a good thing. So fortunately, we learned from 2016. 2018 went very well, and we can always provide maybe some more resources or help to our secretaries of state and counties and whatnot as they make investments in securing our election system. But it really is best done at the state level.
Kevin, that's it. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity, as always, Rob. Talk to you next week.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out most weekday mornings, although I've been getting emails from some of you saying, Rob, where are the episodes? Like I said, I'm on a summer schedule. Things slowed down a little bit. And was focused. I was pretty busy on the blog. And also this week, I'm going to be guest hosting on WDAY Thursday and Friday. So that audio will be up on the podcast feed as well. But I've needed to get ready for that. So just busy, combination of summer schedule and being a little bit busy. So on some other type stuff. But we'll be back to a normal schedule here soon. Also, thanks for everybody who's rated or reviewed the podcast. If you're listening on a platform that allows you to do that, I would appreciate you if it did, because every new rating and review helps other people find this podcast. If you ever have any problems listening to the podcast, you want to give me any feedback, email rob@sayanythingblog.com. Follow me on social media, Rob Port, Say Anything Blog. Search Facebook or Twitter for them. Pretty easy to find. And thanks for listening. I appreciate it. We'll talk again.